Mike Damergis wrote a fascinating book on this, and I enjoyed it very much, and I really liked your approach. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate it, and I love the InXS coming back from the break. That was outstanding. If you talk USFL, talk a little InXS, you're going old school here, so it's a great day.
Is Steve Young actually still cashing checks?
From what I've heard, he has not. He never received that money that he was supposed to get from the USFL and that great franchise, the LA Express.
The LA Express. You took an interesting approach with the book because you really dealt with the key personalities, and a wide range of them, from a Ray Bentley to Steve Spurrier to a Reggie White and so forth. Discuss why you went with that approach, because I liked it, but why did you go with it?
Well, I wanted to cover something for my master's thesis when I was going for my master's in journalism. I want to cover something that wasn't really covered by the mainstream media. And then you get into the USFL, you look at it, and it's so broad, the number of teams, the number of players, and then you had the lawsuit, which is a story waiting to be written in itself. But I wanted to take it from the aspect of the impact the USFL had on the field, and not just with the players, but with changes like the two-point conversion and the instant replay. And I thought that was the biggest event when you look at the players and what a significant impact they had on the field, especially teams, in particular teams that went to the USFL players like the Redskins, and how they went on to win championships like the Giants and so forth.
And, in fact, the interesting part about that is the impact on the NFL today from the USFL is there with the two-point conversion, which the AFL did have, by the way. But the red flag, the challenge flag, that's the USFL's baby.
Well, absolutely. It's something that we've been talking about since the NFL started doing it, like what's the way to implement it? And then the NFL decided they weren't going to use it anymore. How can't you use something that's going to get the call right? I just never understood that about the NFL. And look, the NFL, throughout its history, whether it's adopting leagues, bringing them in, or taking rule changes, that's what the NFL has really done. They've taken what other leagues have done well. They've taken stuff from the XFL even, what they've done well, and they've made it theirs, and look what we have with the NFL. We're in the spring here. We're in March, right before pitchers and catchers. March Madness, where we're talking football. The NFL expanded the draft. Yeah, the NFL Network. People in the USFL knew what they were doing. They knew there was a hunger and there was a thirst for football in the spring. They just blew it, basically, from a business perspective.
No question they did. We'll talk about that in a moment. The other night there was Requiem of the Big East, 30 for 30 on ESPN. And they were talking about how Dave Gavin in 1979, he forms the Big East right when ESPN is formed. When the USFL is formed, it's in its fourth year, ESPN. And the Georgia-Oklahoma lawsuit has now been won by Georgia and Oklahoma, so there's going to be more college football. And the USFL gets a toehold. How much did Pete Rozelle worry about this cable network now associated with the United States Football League?
Boy, I tell you what, there's still a lot to be written about that. I think that that impact is tremendous. I talked to Bob Lee when I was writing the book, and he was up there covering the lawsuit against the USFL against the NFL, and the NFL really strong-armed the networks, particularly ABC at the time had the Sunday game. And the NFL, and this is according to my conversations that I've had, basically told ABC, look, if you carry the USFL in the fall, we're going to pull Monday Night Football from you. And that was the crowning jewel at the time. Monday Night Football, everybody watched Monday Night Football. So the NFL kind of strong-armed the ABC into not carrying it. The NFL has a big impact. It always did, always will be, on what goes where and you know, what kind of programming you're going to have. And that's something that I still think there's a lot to be written about. Al Davis, basically they put him on the stand because he was always suing the NFL. He testified on behalf of the USFL, and he said, look, if you push me too far, I'm going to really start to spill the beans about this league. And I mean, Howard Cosell testified against the NFL.
Right. Yeah, in fact, Al Davis was in the process of the Oakland-Los Angeles thing at the time, and thus he and Pete Rozelle had butted heads over it. Now you brought up the name Al Davis. Al Davis was briefly the last commissioner of the AFL. And when he took over for Joe Foss, he decided we're going to go for the jugular, and they sign quarterbacks left and right. People don't realize that Roman Gabriel and John Brody all signed to play in the AFL at the end, and it forced the merger. Did the USFL use the same quarterback strategy early on?
That was the exact strategy they wanted. They wanted to make a big name splash. They knew the quarterback was the face of the organization, was the face of the league. That's why they went after the big name players, a la Jim Kelly, a la Bobby Hebert, and then of course later on with Doug Flutie. They wanted the big names. Of course, they went with the big name running back at the time, Herschel Walker. I mean, he was the most sought after player at the time. And of course, the NFL won't go after underclassmen, but the USFL broke that league. They wanted to make a statement. They knew the importance of getting big names, and of course the biggest names of all were the quarterbacks early on, and that's why they went after like the Kellys, the Youngs, the Heberts. And they also reached over to the NFL where they pulled Brian Sipe, gave him a life with the Generals, and Vince Evans. I mean, Evans returning to Chicago with the Chicago Blitz.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting is that Herschel Walker, and I remember the impact right away. I mean, you want to talk about, taking a pitch and driving it 500 feet out of the park. When they signed Herschel Walker, the Generals, that did that. But ironically, it was J. Walter Duncan, I believe, who was the owner at the time, and Donald Trump didn't buy the team until after that. Talk about that moment of signing somebody that was not draft eligible by the NFL.
Well, it kind of shook the NFL to its core in a sense that this league's coming around to signing the big name players, and they're doing things that are unorthodox. I mean, even they're having their draft, and I believe it was in January. It was months before the NFL had the draft, and I remember talking to Gil Brandt about it. That the fact that the USFL was having their draft before the NFL was considering moving their draft up a bit because it was too far behind when the USFL's one. And look, the USFL knew what they were doing as far as players. I mean, they recorded players like Dan Marino. I mean, Lee Majors was one of the owners of the LA Express, and there's Dan Marino out there. They looked at players like John Elway. They knew what they were doing. They knew the value that was in these players and the importance of having the draft ahead of the NFL to get these players.
Interesting, Donald Trump had his own style, yet on the other side, a guy he immensely respected had a completely different style. It was John Bassett, who had been in the WFL with the Memphis Southmen / Toronto Northmen. Tell me a little bit about the Tampa Bay Bandits and how popular were they, coached by Steve Spurrier?
Well, let me tell you, that was the fun in the gun. The Bandits at the time were outdrawing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who were completely inept. And you talk about incredible football and incredible fun. The Bandits used to light things up. And they had a great quarterback in John Reeves. Steve Spurrier, I love when I was talking to the ball coach about it. He was talking about that first meeting. They offered him $50,000 to coach the team. $50,000! Which Snyder pay him $5 million a year? And he says, don't you think it's a little embarrassing? So they bumped him up to like $70,000 to coach the team. The next couple of years, he went up to about $125. $150, but it was bandit ball. Bandit ball was fun. 40, 50, 60,000 people at games. Gary Anderson, the great running back who later played with the Chargers. There was a lot of excitement on the team.
Mike, as time went, what were the mistakes that were made that then caused the demise?
Okay, expansion too quickly. They went into markets they shouldn't have been. They went into San Antonio. I remember talking to Bobby Hebert, who later played with the Saints and Falcons. He said he remembers getting bottles thrown at him during the games. They didn't play it. They played basically a high school kind of a stadium. They expanded too quickly, and the push. And this was the mistake. Yeah. They wanted to go to the fall. If they would have stayed in the spring, they had contracts in the spring that were going to extend, that were going to lead to like $150 million with ABC, the ESPN as well. At the time, that was ESPN's foray into play-by-play. Turner Broadcasting at the time was interested in it. They knew the value of sports. They had the contracts to play in the spring. So expanding too much and then going on to take on the NFL in fall football. If they stayed in the spring, who knows what would happen as cable exploded, as we know, over the next years. And
I completely agree with that. And I remember hearing Rick Neuheisel say that when he was with the San Antonio Gunslingers, he said they would give us the checks. He said we would sprint it to the bank.
I heard that from a few organizations. Dan Jiggets, who was a former NFL player rep, also with the Chicago Bears. Now you hear him out in Chicago doing sports radio. He said when we got they ran to the bank to cash those checks because they know first one's cashed, you're going to get your cash. Other than that, your checks are going to start bouncing. So it was very iffy with certain franchises. Certain franchises, did well, and other franchises did not. And the Gunslingers were one of them that did not do well. The Blitz did not do well, and that was just the problem there.
Give me an idea, which franchises actually were doing well and were actually on the path to eventually being something that could turn a profit?
Well, the Generals did well. The Bandits drew well. The Jacksonville Bulls were doing. They were drawing. I remember a game between the Generals. They were doing 70,000 plus a game. They were very popular. The New Orleans Breakers. The Breakers played in 3 different cities: Boston, New Orleans, and then went to Portland. They were doing well. The Gold, another team, the Denver Gold, were doing well initially.
Yeah.
However, when they announced the fact that they were going to go to a fall league and go against the Broncos, well, that's sacrilege. You can't do that, and so their attendance dropped. So there were good enough cities where things were going well. The Michigan Panthers were a very popular team, but again, when you said you were going to go to a fall league, that's when they lost their muster, and they merged with the Oakland Invaders at the time.